We're joining you live from the Ducks Unlimited studio here at One Waterfowl Way in Memphis, Tennessee. I'm Mike Brasher, Senior Waterfowl Scientist, and I'm going to be your host for tonight's event. We thank you for joining us. Fall is right around the corner. Hunting season of one type or another is going to be opening in mere days if it's not already open for some people across the country. And if you're like the rest of us here, you're getting excited because you know this is a time of the year as we look forward. We'll be very soon getting out into the fields, into the marshes, chasing ducks and geese and all sorts of other game with our family and friends. For many of us, this time of year, mid to late August, sort of marks the virtual start to the waterfowl hunting season for us because it's that time of year when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service releases its annual waterfowl population status report. We're all excited about it. We've been looking at it for about the past week. Tonight, we're going to have some fun. We're going to stir some excitement, hopefully. We're going to review the results of this report. We're going to have discussions about which species were up, which species were down, what kind of surprises might have been revealed in the report, what it might mean for you as you go into the field this fall, and what it might mean for your hunting opportunities and harvest regulations next year. I'm joined in studio by four outstanding guests and friends of mine. I'm going to get to those introductions here in a moment. We're joined online by 5 experts from different parts of the country. They're going to help us cover waterfowl population and habitat conditions and issues and other stories that are going to be of interest to many of you. With that, we're going to jump right into the introductions. And so I'm going to go around the room here and just here at my far left, I have Dan Smith, waterfowl scientist for Ducks Unlimited out of California, out of our western region. Dr. Scott Stevens, who many of you will know, our Senior Director of Prairie and Boreal Conservation Strategy. Our good friend Jim Ronquist, Vice President of Development for Drake Waterfowl. Your second time joining us on the Waterfowl Season Outlook.
Yes,
2 years ago you were with us. And Matt Dyson, the only 3-timer that we have here with us, a waterfowl research scientist from DU Canada. Appreciate all them being here with us. And then online, we're just going to kind of go around and introduce them. You'll be hearing from them later on. Amelia Raquel, Ducks Unlimited Regional Biologist out of California. Dr. Mike Schumer, Associate Professor of State University of New York and host of the Fowl Weather Podcast. He's going to be sharing some exciting information about weather with us here shortly. Frank Baldwin, Wildlife Biologist with the Canadian Wildlife Service. He's going to be sharing some information about geese with us here in a moment. Karina Hebert, Ducks Unlimited Regional Biologist out of Salt Lake City, is going to be telling us about some things with the Great Salt Lake, and y'all can get excited about some of the changes we've seen the past few years there. And then Phil Thorpe, a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service pilot biologist, one of the guys that actually flies the survey. So he's going to be able to share with us some of his firsthand observations and other interesting stories. I'll take a moment now to again thank our proud partners, Mossio, the official camo of Ducks Unlimited, and Drake Waterfowl, the official hunting apparel, for helping make tonight possible. We've introduced a new thing this year. It is a 2024 Waterfowl Season Outlook sticker. And so I will direct you to the link in the YouTube description. That's where you can click on that link. It will take you to the webpage where you can learn a little bit more about that, find out how you can acquire one of those. If you like the type of content that we're bringing to you tonight, we encourage you to make a donation, get one of those stickers. Help us continue to do this type of thing in the future. I'll also ask that you like the Ducks Unlimited YouTube channel, subscribe to the Ducks Unlimited YouTube channel. There's all sorts of great content and other information that we're periodically going to be sharing through that channel. There will also be an opportunity for you to submit questions that we will try to get to later on. We're going to go through a lot of information as quick as we can up front, try to leave about a half hour on the back end to get to some of your questions. So use the comment section there on YouTube to submit those questions. We will have a mid-break, kind of halfway through this, for everyone to catch their breath, refill their drinks, and then we'll get right back to it. And so, without any further ado, we're going to jump right into a presentation that we prepared to share some high-level summaries of what the Fish and Wildlife Service Waterfowl Status Report revealed. And so I am going to try to navigate to that right now. Chris, see if we can do that. There we are. All right, we will get started. I do again have to thank all of the partners that make this possible. This is the annual reminder that these are not Ducks Unlimited's numbers. This is not a Ducks Unlimited survey. We see that often on social media and emails. These data and these surveys are made possible by the incredible work, decades of incredible work by our partners in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Canadian Wildlife Service, state and provincial partners all across North America. Two of the reports that we will reference tonight involve the Waterfowl Population Status Report and the Adaptive Harvest Management Report related to the 2025 hunting season. We'll touch on some of that very briefly. Most of what we'll talk about comes from the status report. Some nomenclature to get through here first. You may hear us talking about traditional survey area and eastern survey area. Those are, as you see depicted here, it's sort of common terms that we in this profession use to refer to the different areas within which these numbers are summarized and presented. The traditional survey area generally corresponds to the mid-continent population of birds and some of the western populations. In the eastern survey area, kind of from central Ontario east up into the Canadian Maritimes. There are a few other surveys that are conducted by various states. We'll get to some of those later. If you want a bit more information, you can check out ducks.org/duck numbers, where you'll find the complete chart of each of these species and their changes and population statuses and some other information that we pulled together. And with that, we're going to get right to it. There's a couple of pieces of information that people always go to right off the top of these reports. One is the estimate of total prairie ponds across the U.S. and Canada, because that is viewed as a pretty valuable index of breeding habitat conditions in the ever-important prairie pothole region. What we see this year was the numbers were up 4% from last year. That surprised a lot of people, kind of considering how dry we went into the spring. We're going to talk about that and why we were up. Had a lot of rain that came right as the survey was getting underway. And so these numbers that we saw this year across the U.S. and Canada from a prairie pond standpoint were just about consistent with the long-term average dating all the way back to 1955. One important thing that we noticed was that the conditions differed dramatically between the U.S. and Canada, and Phil can probably speak to this whenever we have him on, but to put the numbers to this, the U.S. pond count was 49% higher this year than last year. It was the highest U.S. pond count in 10 years, and the opposite was kind of true on the Canadian side of things, down 19% from last year, the lowest in 20 years. So a perfect illustration of the dynamic nature of that prairie landscape. A couple of other things that we noted from reports throughout the summer is that there was an early spring leading to early migration. Many birds migrated through the prairies at a time when it was still dry. Rain arrived, as I mentioned, about the time when these surveys were getting underway, and so those birds that came through early didn't necessarily have an opportunity to settle in those environments and take advantage of them. That was responsible for some of the things that we see in terms of the duck population estimates and where they settled out. The rains that did arrive in April and May should be really good for late nesters, re-nesting, and brood production. I'm sure we'll talk about that quite a bit. And let's move on to the duck numbers. We're going to go through a fair number of slides here real quick to provide some high-level orientation, and then we're going to come together and talk about some of our observations and put some more color to this. Total ducks in the traditional survey area this year was 34 million, up 5% from last year, the first increase in about 9 years, first increase since 2015. Down 4% from the long-term average still, and you see the graph here associated with each of these as I'm going to step through. Mallards, everyone always loves to talk about mallards, and they're concerned about that particular species. It was up 8% from last year, which was a welcome sight, but it remains below the long-term average, now down 16%. Northern pintail, a species about which there's a considerable amount of concern, has been for a long period of time. Its population declined 11% from last year, and it remains substantially below the long-term average, down about 50% from that long-term average. Widgeon is a species that I know we'll talk about. It had a surprising increase there, 55% from 2023. We're going to get our thoughts on that number and how to interpret that. Widgeon population, breeding population this year stood at about 3 million, and that's up 12% from the long-term average. Green-winged teal, another boreal nester and a species that's pretty fun to hunt. Up 20% from last year and now up 38% from the long-term average. Blue-winged teal, this one I think is going to be fair to say surprised a few people, down 12% from last year, now below the long-term average for the first time in about 20 years, if my investigation was correct there. And one other way that we look at these numbers is we take some of these prairie nesting dabblers, 4 of them specifically, mallards, gadwalls, shovelers, and blue-wings, to get an overall picture of how those, that group of birds fared this year. We did not include pintails in this. They are definitely a prairie nester, but whenever we put the pintail numbers in here, the trend associated with them kind of swamps everything else that we're showing. So just remember that, just know that that's why they are not in this particular display. Down 4% from last year collectively across these 4 species. Down 9% from the long-term average. One of the very interesting things, though, and this relates to what we were talking about a bit earlier in terms of the timing of the spring, where some of that moisture fell, the Boreal and Alaska strata, the more northern reaches of this survey, saw a 31% increase in the breeding population estimate for those 4 species. And the prairie strata were down 14%. That's a classic demonstration of what we describe when we say these birds overflew the prairies because it was dry and settled in the parklands and Boreal. Redheads, we have a few diving ducks to kind of touch on here. Redheads down 16% from last year. They're closely tied to wetland conditions in the prairies, up 6% from the long-term average still. Canvasbacks, 8% down from last year, down 4% from the long-term average. Scaup, a boreal nester itself, up 16% from last year and down 17% below the long-term average. I went through that really quick, and we can come back to those as we need to. So, reactions, Jimbo, I'm going to go to you first. Okay. What were your reactions because this is a report that you pay attention to and you look forward to. What were your reactions when you saw all that information come out?
Yeah, absolutely. Like many people, I was pleasantly surprised. I think we all had the idea that we was going to see mallard numbers really tank after last year. I was pleasantly surprised. Still a little worried about our pintails, green wings, and when you get over to the eastern survey area, looking at the big jump in black ducks. I love black ducks. Cool to see what's going on there. Just again, very, very pleasantly surprised. Interesting on where some of these increases came from. Mm-hmm. Talking about the Boreal and Alaska and whatnot. So yeah, I'm looking forward to digging deep with y'all and hearing your thoughts.
Scott, you and I have talked about this just about a week ago. So give us your synopsis.
We have. Well, we've established that I'm a pessimist, so I predicted they were going to be down. So
are we going to go there? We're going to revisit who was right and who was wrong?
I think I recall an earlier podcast about his pessimism.
Yeah,
I think
that's right.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, given conditions last year, I didn't expect the numbers to go up because, you think about it, any of the increases that we saw in these numbers came as a result of production last year. And I guess the consensus was we didn't think that was very good. So it was good enough to see increases. So that's good.
Dan, you're out in the western region. Whenever this report comes out, you probably look to northern Alberta, British Columbia, obviously the local states, California, Oregon, Washington. We're going to get into sort of the western region numbers a little bit later on. We're also going to touch on the eastern survey area numbers later on. But from an Alaska standpoint, how closely did you scrutinize those numbers? And there were a few, last year, total duck numbers in Alaska were down 50%. That was a shocker, right? I think they were up this year like 28%, if I remember correctly. So your assessment, what did you look for?
From what we saw breeding condition-wise last spring, it seemed to be really good. So I would expect kind of to see that rise, a bit opposite of what you were talking about. But some of those species, particularly that I'd like to see more of from a hunting perspective, tended to be east of Alaska. So we'll see how that ends up panning out. But it was good to see Alaska in good condition again and seeing those numbers go up.
Matt, some of your notable observations when this first came out.
Yeah, certainly surprised. Like Scott, I was a little bit pessimistic about what the numbers would look like just from being in Canada and seeing the conditions on the prairies over the last while and fairly long-term drought. And I think some of our core species, the trends that we see in those reflect that pattern, and especially with pintail and blue-winged teal, their core breeding area, it's in long-term drought, and even with a little bit of rain, sort of remains in that long-term drought. So no big surprises there from those numbers, but hopefully we see conditions improve, and that's when we'd expect to see those populations maybe respond a little bit better.
So with regard to the way these dabbling ducks settled on the landscape, and given what we were hearing and what we read about in the report, it was really dry coming into the spring. I mean, we were concerned, very concerned about what the pond count could have been, but as we got into late April, rain, maybe some snow. I can't remember exactly how that fell out, but definitely some rain improved things on the prairies. It was too late for some of those early migrants to move through, and so we saw birds, as we said earlier, go through into the Boreal, and that's not necessarily a surprising observation for us based on what we were hearing. But what does it mean? What do we know? What do we think we know, Scott, or anybody, about what that means for production this year? I think more than half of half or more of the pintails that were counted were counted in some of those Boreal strata. What can we say about kind of the productivity of that landscape relative to the prairies?
Yeah. Well, we should have Matt weigh in too, because he's done work up there. But I think we would say that, the populations are generally not as productive as they are when we have really wet conditions across the prairies. So for like pintails, we see the booms in their populations when the prairies are wet. If they're moving further north, probably not as productive. But Matt, you should talk about your view too.
Yeah, and I think as a general rule, that's our understanding. But we do know that those birds can be productive in some of those landscapes, and some production is better than none at all on some of those prairie areas where it's been very dry for a while as well. And so I think we would expect some production out of those areas, but certainly not when habitat conditions are greatly improved in the prairies.
Jimbo, any species that you wanted to dig into here while we have a few minutes?
As you talk about the water and some of the water being late too, how that affected our mallards. Again, not to beat the dead horse, but I was surprised to see mallards make an uptick at all. Some of my buddies were betting, were we going to see mallard bee pop in the 5 million something range? So to see that increase, where did it come from? How did we get that? Was it those April rains? Was there some habitat changes on the landscape? Where do y'all think those increases came from?
I'm going to let Scott answer that here in a minute, but I'm going to say this first. I'm going to say this first. This is a good opportunity to remind folks that the numbers that are in this report, this is the breeding population size. These are the birds that were left over after last year, made it through, started fall last year, made it through hunting season, through winter, and then made their way back up to the breeding grounds far north. So that's the first important thing to remember. The birds that made it to the breeding ground, they will then have produced some ducklings. They'll hopefully fledge. Duckling production, survival should be pretty good this year in the prairies, given all that rain and improved wetland conditions there. Then that collection of birds, the adults plus the young, is of course what makes up the fall flight. That's what we as hunters are getting excited about. So that's an important reminder to provide there. I guess, Scott, whenever there is some possibility that there was better production in some areas than what we might have anticipated. There's also, I think, just some inherent noise in the survey that we have to acknowledge. It's not a complete census. No one ever says it was, and so there is some inherent variation from year to year. With that said, it's always great to see an increase, even with that variation, than to see another 10 or 15% decline. Mm-hmm. And when you look at age ratios from the harvest report that came out, they were about average. They were consistent over the past 2 years. So that told me there was some pretty good production in some areas.
Yeah, I would also point out it was really only mallards that bucked the trend for what we would call prairie nesting dabblers, right? And I think most of the bump didn't happen in the prairie strata, happened in the more northern strata, which was the overall trend that we saw across all the species.
And Mike, not to bring any more pessimism to any, but just
one is enough. One is enough here.
But as we would think about, when we do see some of the declines in some of our species, 1 year doesn't necessarily make a trend, and I think that's the same probably here with our mallards this year. Of it's great to see them up, and hopefully that continues. But we'll be watching next year's report as well to see where that number goes.
That's a good point. It brings me to something else while you're talking about that. As you talk about the late water, how much of an increase in recruitment could that mean for us to hopefully see that mallard bee pop jump again next year?
Who wants to take that one? Scott?
Sure. Yeah, I think, when we got the rains, everybody always wants to know, well, what's that going to mean? Well, it wasn't going to change our breeding population. That was already locked in. But it does improve the ability of the birds to re-nest, which is important because most of them will lose at least first nests, and also improves conditions for the ones that are successful in hatching a nest, what brood survival will be like. And with those rains, and I know conditions that I saw even across the Dakotas, when you have flooded emergent vegetation, that's really ideal conditions for broods. So I would say we'll see an improvement in production from conditions that we had last year at this time. So how much always remains to be seen.
And we really need, we've said this every year that we've been talking about this, we need multiple years of sustained wet conditions across broad swaths of the prairies. So we don't have that yet. I mean,
that's right. Yeah, I mean, even when we talk about the rains, they didn't happen everywhere. And I think when we get to Phil, he'll talk about the fact that there were still some strata that they surveyed that, the rains kind of missed and are still pretty dry. So, we tend to generalize here, but it depends on where you're at in a geography the size of that we're talking about here.
I'm seeing a few comments come in already, and some of this may require us to kind of dig into some of the strata-specific estimates for some of these species, which we could do. We'll have to kind of wait and see how time goes. But I think at this point, to kind of stay on time, what I want to do is go back to my presentation. Chris, let's see if we can make this work. What happens whenever... There we go. So we're going to move on to this. This was one of the important questions that... one of the things that a lot of hunters were really keen to see when these reports came out. What does this mean for harvest regulations for 25-26? Very important note here is that the harvest regulations for this year, for 24-25, are locked in. They're not going to change. It doesn't matter if we're talking pintails, mallards, teal, whatever. They're all locked in right now. The results that came out last week are not going to affect those. We're talking about the regulations for 25-26. Fish and Wildlife Service now sets regulations a year in advance. I will also note that the U.S. and Canada set their regulations separately, so nothing that we talk about here tonight is going to relate to Canadian harvest regulations. The Fish and Wildlife Service uses adaptive harvest management models and other harvest strategies in collaboration with all of our state agencies to set these regulations on an annual basis. And I will also say that at this time, states have yet to weigh in. They still have to have opportunities to weigh in by way of their Flyway Council. All those are ongoing. So here are the notable things that came from this year's numbers and the companion adaptive harvest management report that came out at the same time. For the 25-26 season, based on these results, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is expected to recommend liberal duck season frameworks for all flyways next year. Also, for the first time since 1997, hunters across the U.S. are expected to have an opportunity for a 3 pintail daily limit across all flyways. That is a result of a brand new interim pintail harvest strategy that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recently approved. In the Atlantic flyway, the expected recommendation will be for a 4 mallard daily limit, a 2 black duck daily limit within the liberal duck season framework. An important change for many hunters for the first time since the harvest strategy, current harvest strategy for blue-winged teal was implemented back in, I think, 2014. We expect a recommendation for a 9-day early teal season in response to the decline in blue wings. And so...
all of this for next year.
All of this is for next year. And so Chris, you can take that down now. And so an important thing here is I know people are going to have a ton of questions about this. We are not the people to answer those questions. We're Ducks Unlimited. We're a habitat conservation organization. Yes, we pay attention to these things, and yes, we try to communicate some of this information out to hunters and our members. But when it comes to answering questions about why this regulation for this species, why this regulation for that species, that's not our domain. We do not have a seat at those tables. We do not have the authority to really weigh in on those decisions. I can tell you that through some of our other platforms, whether it be our magazine or the Ducks Unlimited podcast, we do plan on engaging with our state and federal partners to bring some additional details to some of those issues, whether it be another liberal season for mallards across all flyways, or for duck seasons across all flyways, or whether it be the new interim pintail harvest strategy. We're going to try to get some of that information out to y'all, but it's going to have to come from the right people. So if you're wanting us to answer those questions tonight, I'm sorry, you're going to be disappointed. But that's just not our expertise, and that's not where we operate. So.
May be disappointed on other fronts, but that's a different story.
That's right. So at this time, we're going to shift gears a little bit. We're still going to be talking about the results from this survey, and I think we want to queue up one of our panelists. I introduced him earlier, Phil Thorpe, a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service pilot biologist, and I am going to toss this over to my good friend, Scott Stevens, to lead this discussion. Scott?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Phil, I know you've been engaged in these surveys for a long time, have had a long career, and many of your colleagues are in the same boat. Maybe you can talk with us about what you and the crews saw as you were beginning those surveys this year and how those observations compared to last year and kind of what you would call average conditions out there.
I think we got you on mute there, Phil. No, don't have you. A little technical difficulty here. It's bound to happen.
Wouldn't be.
It's live.
Wouldn't be one of these things if everything worked.
We tested everything.
Mute.
Oh, there we go.
There we go.
Take two.
All right. Thanks for having me on again. I've been involved in this survey for 25 years in southern Saskatchewan, and more recently I've been flying a little bit of Montana because of personnel shortages. So it was another interesting year. They all are different, even over 25 years. You don't get bored of flying the same area. But the rains did come just as we arrived in Montana, really, at the beginning of May. And as we moved up to Saskatchewan, they continued. The area needed it. It's been in a long-term drought, as you guys mentioned. And really, since some of those peaks in 15, 16, 17, it's gone downhill since then. There's been little bright spots in Saskatchewan, but for the most part, it's been droughty and getting worse. And this year is worse than last year. The rains were great to have. You need a whole lot more rain to make the province whole again. It's kind of like a couple drops on a dry sponge. It helps a little bit. It did regenerate some wetlands in certain areas, and birds took advantage of that. But for the most part, the grasslands are, and I think you mentioned average at one point, but that map that I create showing poor, fair, good, and excellent in the status report is really what I think of as a potential for production map. And it only has the 4 categories. And if it had a 5th category, I would say everything's poor to below average in Saskatchewan for the most part. There's a couple little areas in the Coteau and in the very southwest corner of Saskatchewan that are really in good shape, but the majority of the grasslands are in poor to below average condition. Many dry wetlands. With those dry wetlands, you get farmers going in to those wetlands and plowing them and seeding them. So there's extensive wetland damage in the grasslands. And now this is one of the drier years I've seen in the parklands of Saskatchewan, especially the central and western parklands, where there's a lot of dry wetlands. And so there is no flooded emergent vegetation in a lot of areas in those wetlands. Doom and gloom, but what we are seeing in our banding effort up here, which we're doing now, is that we're finding pre-molt mallards and pintails, which you could interpret as, which we don't normally see. So the interpretation for that is that they're a couple weeks late, and they probably had some re-nesting effort after that rain arrived. Found some habitat, hopefully got some broods off, but they're a couple weeks late for their normal molt. We usually don't see pre-molt, which is they haven't molted their wings yet, in our banding effort. It's usually they're flighted and ready to go with new wings. So that's a little hint what we're seeing in banding. And what we also are seeing is blue wings are ready to go. Last year, we saw a lot of pre-molt and in-molt blue wings, which is extremely rare for banding in August. Usually they're ready to go. They're more photo period driven. So they're ready to go in August and get in our traps and leave, where mallards and pintails are a little slower and not really, especially with the warmer temperatures. It's been really hot in the province. Province has been getting more rain. We got 1.5 inches just the other day in Saskatoon, but it's thunderstorms, so very isolated. And the wetlands I passed on the way down to one banding station had a little skim of water, where a week ago they were completely dry, but just not enough to, help that much. They need a lot of snow this winter and a lot of rain into the fall.
Yeah, thanks for that, Phil. I'm curious, in the banding, do you or your crews have any insight into age ratios of young birds and what you've seen for evidence of production this year?
Blue wings look like they're about average from what we see. Usually it's a little biased with banding depending on where we're banding. If we're banding on a molting marsh, we'll get a lot of adult male mallards and very few other, we'll get some immatures, but they usually don't reflect the true production of what's going on in my experience. So blue wings looked good. Mallards and pintails we're seeing hatchier birds in the cats. We're seeing more adults, but that's typical. So it's hard to say we're seeing this many immatures, so
right.
Production is excellent.
Yeah.
But there is production, which is good.
Yeah. Well, you guys see all of this information firsthand as you're in the plains and banding the birds on the ground. So we appreciate that insight, Phil. Thank you.
So, Phil, go ahead, Phil.
Oh, I was just going to mention one bright spot was I was listening to an agricultural forecaster, and he was going on about all kinds of stuff and matching what we've seen and are seeing. But he mentioned about La Nina not strengthening like it was predicted and possibly weakening. And if that happens, if La Nina doesn't happen as strong as it was or doesn't happen at all, that will be beneficial to the prairies. Usually brings more rain and better winters. So there's a bright spot to look for.
Well, you are queuing up one of our forthcoming panelists here, and we're going to move on to that right now to kind of stay on track. Phil, are you going to be able to stay with us for the remainder of the evening?
Yeah,
okay.
Sure.
All right, good. We may come back to you with a few other questions. People may wonder what it's like to be a pilot biologist. What's the best thing about it? If somebody's interested, what can they do to kind of pursue that career? But we're going to move on right now, and I'm going again test my technological skills here, which
Look
Oh
out.
boy.
I know. Let's see here. I'm gonna go back to the PowerPoint. Let's see. There we go. All right. Yep, we are back up here, and we're going to talk about the Eastern Survey area just briefly. You know, this is a more stable environment when you look at the wetlands of that Eastern Canada geography. We've talked about this a number of times in various discussions. Matt and Scott and I have, and so we don't expect to see, and we don't see large changes in population size of ducks from one year to the next in the Eastern Survey area, and that was kind of again the case here. Two species we're going to focus on. One is the mallard, down slightly from last year, just a little bit below the long-term average. Jimbo already mentioned black ducks. Their population is actually in it's a pretty interesting bright spot right now, up 17% last year, up 23% from the long-term average. There are a number of other species that are referenced in the Eastern Survey area numbers, including green-winged teal, ring-necked ducks, golden eyes, mergansers. We also throw wood ducks in there. And so all of those species were in pretty good shape and kind of up a little bit or relatively flat from last year, which is pretty much what we'd expect. Now, for wood ducks, they are obviously notoriously difficult to survey. In the Atlantic Flyway, they do use a model-based estimation procedure to get at this population estimate, 0.9 million, which is similar to the long-term average. So we can talk about that a little bit. Maybe I'll Matt, I think you had some things you wanted to remark about some of these numbers here, so I'll toss it to you.
Well, sure, Mike. Yeah, and I think even just with wood ducks, we look at the Atlantic flyway estimate there too, but there's also some of the Lincoln estimates for other flyways for wood ducks as well. It's an important species in a lot of hunters' bags in that region, and overall those populations have been relatively stable this year and from last year, and also really over the last 10 years in terms of a lot of those estimates of population change are kind of overlapping zero. So we've had years where they're down, years where they're up, but overall fairly stable population. So a good thing for wood duck numbers, and again, that's related to a lot of the habitat stability in Eastern Survey area.
Either of y'all spent much time in Eastern Canada visiting those?
Nope.
No? Jimbo, you ever been there?
Going this year for the first time.
Whereabouts?
Going to Prince Edward Island.
Prince
for
Edward
a DU Nation episode.
Are you really?
But I have never been in Eastern Canada.
Well, I guarantee you're going to enjoy that. You'll have to tell us all about it once you get back. We'll probably come back to some of the discussion about Eastern Survey area. If you're from the Atlantic Flyway and you want us to talk about some of the populations in your area, throw a comment into the YouTube, throw a question into the YouTube comment section, and we'll try to get to it here in a little bit. At this point, given that Phil kind of nicely introduced the meteorological phenomenon of La Nina, we're going to go to one of our guests online, Dr. Mike Schumer. He is an associate professor at State University of New York, also the host of the Foul Weather podcast. Mike, are you there?
I'm here. Do you have me?
Man, we got you. And so all right. It's great to see you, and thanks for joining us. Thank you for joining us tonight. And I'll throw it right to you and just have you give us an update on La Nina. What can you tell us? You are you're a meteorologist kind of in training in my book. And so we have you on occasionally to speak to us about weather and other phenomena that intersect waterfowl and waterfowl hunting. So what can you tell us about La Nina to start with?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Appreciate that, and appreciate bringing all these good folks together tonight to talk about this stuff. It really looks like we are, as Phil had alluded to, this La Nina thing, we thought it might be at the strong level. It's going to be, a weak to moderate. That really has a few potential effects across North America, the upper Northwest kind of region. In the Pacific has kind of this cold and wet kind of conditions that happen. The prairies, as you go into winter, tend to be cold, and the snow is a toss-up, right? Like if we end up in more of a neutral situation where the Pacific Ocean temperatures are not either too hot or too cold, then we're definitely in a real toss-up. And that can lead to either really mild conditions across North America for duck migration and prairie conditions, or it can lead to really pretty severe conditions. But if it's at least a weak to moderate La Nina, then we probably end up with some cold. And I think Scott Stevens recently talked about this somewhere, that, if we can lock up what water we have on the prairies and get it like really, really nice and cold, then maybe we can hold that water over too. But the snow would be kind of key with that La Nina, or weak La Nina or neutral, if we can get that in the prairies. That's what we're really going to be looking for. Great Lakes under those conditions tends to be relatively wet. And then the Southwest tends to be dry. And the Southeast region, what I'd say kind of the core of duck country and a lot of this country, the Mississippi Delta and across over towards the Southeast U.S. tends to be kind of like a warm and dry condition, unfortunately. So a little bit of a toss-up yet. And I do want to say that like those folks that have forecast the fall weather already, right? So September, October, November is kind of a pretty solid long-term forecast, but that NOAA, National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, does not release their winter forecast, which is really December, January, February until October. So we're a little ways out from being confident about this stuff, Mike.
So, Mike, teal season is right around the corner. It's pretty dry in some places down here. What does that fall forecast look like in, let's say, the southern central Mississippi Atlantic flyway?
Yeah, as Phil alluded to, these critters, relative to is compared to the other dabbling ducks, the blue wings tend to just leave town when the daylight is right. They go down to Central America, South America, so they're generally boogieing. What he said about that late molt, maybe on second brood stuff, is a new one to me. I had not heard that yet, but blue wings should be on the move. It's pretty warm, but they're just going to go anyway. Blue wings just make that movement. So yeah, the Delta region, parts of Tennessee are pretty dry. Kansas is really dry. Oklahoma Panhandle is pretty dry. But most everybody else in kind of like duck country where there's blue wing seasons are pretty solidly in a non-drought situation. So those folks that can manage and pump some water where you're dry, I'd say do that. You don't want to till down all your moist soil, but if you can put a disc on stuff and make hot mud, I'm a fan of hot mud for blooms. That's kind of going to be your ticket.
Mike, what about, let me ask you about the Eastern Survey area numbers. Whenever this report comes out, I know you geek out on it the same way the rest of us do. You live up in the Northeast. You firsthand experience some of the weather conditions throughout spring and summer. I suspect you keep a closer eye on kind of what's happening north of you, because those are some of the birds that you and your wife hunt this fall. What was your takeaway, and anything notable from those Eastern Survey area results first, and then your thoughts on anything else that you saw in the report?
Yeah, I think it was genuinely refreshing. I mean, the mallards being down a little bit, I'm not surprised with. They're going through some stuff, which is a longer conversation, I think, than we can have here. But we're really stable in the East, right? And as opposed to, other places, we almost need to be a little more dry. Like, we have water. We're not water deficient in general. In these really late wet and cold springs, it seems like ducks over this way kind of act kind of like an upland bird, like turkeys and grouse and stuff. And if you get really a cold, wet, late spring, it's hard on them. And our May and June were just about average precipitation, and we were really warm. Our May through July in the Northeast U.S., and I would expect this is true of Southern Canada as well, was nearly record warm, right, on average. And our minimum temperatures, this is one that matters for duckling survival, our minimum temperatures were 130 of 130 years around where I'm at here in central New York and in the Finger Lakes region and Great Lakes. So we were very warm, and that's great for duckling survival. And then July got wet, so we put water back on that landscape and probably flooded places for ducklings and goslings and such to find good food. So I think we're in really good shape. I think we just need the weather now to move birds. That's been our problem. I mean, where we're at in New York, Southern Ontario, those folks get ducks every year. I mean, they come out of the Boreal, they move into those locations, and then they hang there until there's weather. And so it's folks like in North Carolina, South Carolina, Maryland, Chesapeake Bay, sometimes that tend to be hurting for ducks. So I think we're set up in the Atlantic Flyway for not like we're in the Mississippi, but for what we get, I think we're in pretty good shape this year.
What about Great Lakes? That's a place where we haven't talked about yet. I know that you're familiar with that area. You keep an eye on what's happening there. Any comments from what you might have seen from those state survey reports?
I have not. I'll be honest.
Sorry to throw you a curveball.
You threw me a curveball. Yeah. I haven't kept track. If you had somebody from Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, they could tell you more. I mean, I know long-term Michigan's had mallard problems. I think
they were up this year.
You'd have to look at it. I think they were up, right?
They were up substantially this year. Some of that could have been related to maybe capturing some of the birds, some of the migrants, they think, maybe in that survey. There's a lot of things happening there from some of those states when they're doing that survey. Did you have something?
Well, just as we talked about, Mike, you talked about the forecast for the fall, especially in the prairies. That's when we kind of set the stage. Either if we have rains in the fall going into the freeze up, that's really good. We have that good soil moisture, get what we call a good frost seal, and then any snow we accumulate can add up and then run off in the spring. So that's something that will impact conditions next spring that we start looking at, even in October, early November as we go into freeze up in the prairies.
Any other questions for Mike here?
I don't know if it's a question as much as a comment, but you talk about weather and weather trends and evolution. We got black bellies hanging out in Stuttgart all summer long. We got weather patterns are changing. Is this a long-term piece of evolution? How fast is it moving? Do we think it's going to retract? What do we think is going to move on with that?
That's a fantastic question. In the all the indicators say we're moving towards being warmer. But here's the thing. Within that, there is still a lot of fluctuation that is occurring. And like this year, my goodness, there's no way we can be as warm as last year's duck season and have as abysmal of a migration as we had. In all indications of at least a weak to moderate La Nina with cold coming up in the mid-continent, we should be pushing birds south. It's going to happen late. It's going to happen in December and January, but it's going to happen. And so we're going to see these fluctuations back and forth. So the best thing to do is, look towards those long-term forecasts, find ways to, figure out what weather's out there that moves ducks, and, go hunt them when they're moving, because those are, especially on a year like this, like if we had a good, second nesting attempt and a lot of naive ducks out there and we get some weather, folks are going to have some good shooting. So, this stuff depends on the duck population. It depends on the weather. It depends on the habitat. And, last year, those things, the stars aligned against us. Low duck population, really warm weather, and it was really dry. And my expectation is this year we are actually in almost, I'm optimistic. I'm not like those guys, but I'm on the line of, I think the stars are going to align and we're going to have, a relatively good season of good movement of naive birds, despite the population not being where we want it to be. And then hopefully snows on the prairies and, we get the momentum to bring birds back and get a bump in population that we want to see going forward.
And we're all looking forward to it. We have picked up some blue wings, though. I will attest to that. Yeah, we got a few blue wings showing up on the prairie. The Southern Prairie.
Southern Prairie, the Grand Prairie of Arkansas. All right, be good. Scott, were you taking notes on that optimism that Mike was bringing?
I did. I'm trying to have it rub off on me. It'll take a while for it to set in, I think.
Mike, I like the way you think. You're going to be able to stick around with us for the rest of the evening as well, right?
Yeah, I will. I might blink out, but refill my water and such, but I'll be around with y'all.
I understand. I appreciate that very much. We've got about 5 more minutes, and then we're going to take a break. This thing goes by fast when you're on this side of it all. So I want to throw it to Matt Dyson now to talk about sort of a Boreal update, what we saw from that landscape. We've alluded to some of it already. The Boreal is a massive landscape, and so you can focus on the Western Boreal if you'd like to. You can frame that up however you'd like to. But that was, despite there being a substantial number of birds that settled in the Boreal, there were still some pretty dry areas, at least in the Western Boreal. So kind of give us the, I don't know, 50,000-foot view of Boreal Canada this year.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And I think we'll stay focused on the Western Boreal, but I think a lot of the similar information can apply across the Boreal forest across the country. But obviously, a larger area, we did see those upticks in a lot of our populations where a lot of those birds were. And generally, we think of that of being, we have stable, wet conditions there, a little bit different types of wetlands, larger lakes, although some of those lakes are less productive than some of our prairie wetlands would be in terms of ability to help produce ducks. But I think one of the concerning things for myself, at least, in thinking about the Boreal forest, and, over the long term, we found, things like wildfire have not really been shown to have any effect on populations. But in Canada last year, we had 15 million hectares burned, which is about 3 times the previous annual average. We continue to kind of set records for hectares burning. It's less this year, thankfully, but I think we've had larger changes, and those conditions with changing climate as well experience more drought in those regions. And so really trying to think about how those might be affecting some of those populations or the stability of that system, I think are, some of the questions that are starting to kind of come into my head as we continue to see that shift. But it's continued to show that ability to support and be stable. But I think some of those larger changes that are happening should draw some of our attention here.
One of the things that I was looking at in I guess it's the hunter and the harvest and hunter activity report that the Fish and Wildlife Service puts out along with some of these other documents was the age ratio data, and it maintained for most years it kind of fluctuates a little bit around the mean, around the average, which to me
makes sense.
It makes sense. Well, what I'm going to get to is that if you go back to 2021, could we talk about the importance of the prairies and really boosting productivity? But in 2021, we didn't have the survey, but by all accounts, it was incredibly dry. And if you look at the age ratio data for 21, it was really, really low. And so then it has picked back up the past 2 years to right around the average. And so a lot of times whenever people ask us questions like, well, what do you think duck production is going to be like this year? I think typically we'll say maybe about average. And so part of that is because of this. Part of it is because the prairie, it's very rare, as we've talked about, for the entire U.S. and Canadian prairie to get so wet that it's cranking on all cylinders, right?
And like 2011.
And you've got a large breeding population size to take advantage of that. Otherwise, it's like you've got some portions of the prairies that are wet, some portions that are dry, and you've got this big, relatively much more stable, kind of system up there, up north that's doing its thing.
Big fish factory is what
Big fish
Johnny
factory.
Lynch dubbed it.
You can go.
Yeah.
You can tell that story.
But it produces some ducks.
Well, and Phil kind of touched on it with his overview as well, right? We have local areas where we had water in the prairies this year, but the majority of the really productive prairie habitat kind of remains in that long-term drought, and it's that habitat that when it gets wet, that's when we see big productivity numbers.
Just mention that one of my notes I made as you go through it. So the Mallard bee pop has broke 10 million 4 times since 1955. That's only 4 times in a pretty big span of calendar.
Right.
Mm-hmm. That's a magical event for that to happen.
That's right.
And what are all those steps come together? Water, grass, ponds, everything's got to be just right.
Yeah, exactly. I think what it is, like the last time I remember we were like that was 2011, and in the winter of 2010-11, we had, massive snow, deer were dying across the landscape in the prairies, and then there was flooding all over the place when the snow ran off. So, now that impacted a lot of communities, and, there were a lot of challenges associated with that. But man, there were ducks everywhere that spring.
Yeah. Hopefully we'll see that again one day.
Yeah, I think we will. The challenge that we have, I think, that you alluded to, Jimbo, is have we been able to maintain the grasslands and the wetland basins to hold that water so the birds can take advantage? And unfortunately, we've seen losses in some of those front. We summarized some of that for recent duck symposium. Since 2011, we've lost about 10 million acres of grassland across the prairies. So I think if you ask us if we got that wet again, would we see the same response from ducks? Probably not quite as good as we saw it then. So the habitat base is something that we got to stay focused on.
So that begs the question, as our Director of Prairie and Boreal Conservation Strategy.
When am I going to fix
What's your
that?
strategy for rectifying that situation?
I'm just going to ask, how do we negate that? Yeah.
Yeah, well, and the good news is that there are a bunch of really smart folks who are working on that every day. Our teams in the Great Plains with DU Canada and the Prairies, and our Boreal team that works with First Nations and communities across the north are focused on maintaining the habitat that we have. So we talk about reducing loss rates and increasing protection rates is really the recipe to keeping what we have. And then we'd like to do some restoration and put some of that back. But 10 million acres of grass is a big challenge. So, having it not slide to losing 15 million, that's kind of the focus for sure.
And with that, we are right on track down to the minute. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and I'm going to put our Western region folks on notice. We have had 2 comments come in asking about cinnamon teal. So what's their population status? So you've got 5 minutes. If you don't already have the answer, you've got 5 minutes to do your research and figure that out. And we're going to come back, and we're going to talk about that's where we're going to go right off the bat is a report from our Western region staff. We have 3 of them here, and looking forward to that. Stay with us. We'll be back in 5 minutes.
Do you enjoy the Ducks Unlimited Waterfowl Season Outlook? Every year, DU brings you exclusive insights for the hunting season. And in 2024, we're kicking it off with something special, a limited edition WSO 2024 sticker, available only through the end of August. Don't miss out. Visit give.ducks.org/WSO drop now and secure yours while supplies last. Plus, subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss a beat. Your donations and subs make this content possible. Let's keep the tradition alive, together. Do you enjoy the Ducks Unlimited Waterfowl Season Outlook? Every year, DU brings you exclusive insights for the hunting season. And in 2024, we're kicking it off with something special, a limited edition WSO 2024 sticker, available only through the end of August. Don't miss out. Visit give.ducks.org/WSO drop now and secure yours while supplies last. Plus, subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss a beat. Your donations and subs make this content possible. Let's keep the tradition alive, together.
Welcome back, everyone. We are here again, still live at the Ducks Unlimited studio in Memphis, Tennessee. And thanks for joining, for coming back. And I guess I will, at this time, again, say thank you to our partners, Mossy Oak and Drake Waterfowl, for joining us tonight and helping be part of this. I'll also, one more time, kind of point out the opportunity for you to contribute to Ducks Unlimited and show us that you enjoy the type of content that we're producing. Help us continue to make this possible. Reminder of the stickers that are going to be available, and you can, this is something that we've started new for this year. And so then the QR code is here. Scan that, go and make a donation. You'll get a sticker. And if we do this next year, you will have an opportunity to get another one for 2025 Waterfowl Season Outlook, something that we're going to try to keep going.
Brought to you by the Shameless Commerce Division.
That's right. That's right. At this point, we're going to move out west to the Pacific Flyway. This was like a last-minute agenda change we had earlier today. It's like, let's move the Pacific Flyway discussion to a little bit later, realizing that whenever we started, it would be like 5 o'clock, 5 p.m. And so that's a late change, and hopefully that's going to be beneficial to folks that are just now tuning in. And we're going to go first to Amelia Raquel to ask her to give us the latest update on probably the highest profile waterfowl topic in the Pacific Flyway right now, that being what's happening and has been happening in the Klamath Basin. It's been sort of a roller coaster spring, summer, now into fall. And Dan is going to help me as we kind of go through this. But on the backside, I'm going to ask him to talk about a few other things. But Amelia, give us the rundown. Like, for people that aren't familiar with Klamath Basin, it's obviously incredibly important for waterfowl. We don't have to cover the history of that area, but talk to us about what happened in spring, the arrival of water, how the birds responded, and then what's going on now.
Sure. So for those that are less familiar with Western wetlands, pretty much all of our wetlands are reliant on surface water deliveries and are part of pretty complex irrigation systems. And so specific to the Klamath and all of Northeastern California and Southern Oregon, we rely on snowpack and then spring runoff. So in the Klamath this year, we had a pretty good snowpack. Upper Klamath Lake, which is a primary reservoir, which also provides water to both Lower Klamath and Tule Lake National Wildlife Refuges, was full. So both those refuges received surface water deliveries early this year. Several units that haven't seen water in 4 or 5 years were full. So that was really great news. And the birds responded immediately. And then as the arid west is, it came hot, conditions dried, wetlands dried through evaporation. And now we kind of saw the threat of botulism about a couple weeks ago. So the most recent update is our Klamath watershed community, including tribal nations and irrigation partners, all came together and found a collaborative solution to provide water to both Lower Klamath and Tule Lake. So there's currently water going to both those refuges, which is great news.
So that's good news right now. One of the other things, and Amelia, I don't know how much I don't know what kind of information is even available right now, but having additional water flowing into those units is definitely great. What about longer term as we get into the fall? Is it too early to know what hunting opportunities might be available either there on either of those refuges or in the broader region?
So Klamath specifically, they're having their hunter information meeting next week. So we don't know yet what opportunities might exist on those refuges. But outside of Klamath, I've heard from other managers that conditions in Northeastern California should be pretty good for hunting, as well as Southeastern Oregon, because again, we did have some pretty good snowpack, so good wetland conditions in those areas.
Any notable observations on types of species that responded very well to the water this spring, whether based on observations, based on banding data? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so in Klamath specifically, those wetlands had been dry for several years, and then they received water, and those wetlands responded almost immediately, and so changes in the wetland vegetation occurred, and we've seen actually a huge response in submerged aquatic vegetation, and therefore huge numbers of redheads are being banded right now, which is pretty cool to see. Lots of canvasback, lots of pintails, lots of green-winged teals. So they're actually seeing really great production this year across Klamath and southeastern Oregon.
Amelia, we'll keep you on for a little while. And maybe we'll talk about a few other things here a little bit later on. I'm really interested in a lot of the work that we're doing out there to help out with the Klamath water issues and trying to provide additional opportunities, be more efficient with some of the management that's going on to take advantage of what water is available. But we'll get to that a little bit later on. At this point, I want to shift gears and talk to Karina Hebert to give us an update from the Great Salt Lake. It's one of the 3 highest priority wetland complexes and areas for waterfowl in the Pacific Flyway. Dan and Karina and Amelia, I'm sure all 3 of you could tell us all about those. But so Karina, the importance of the Great Salt Lake, I think, is probably not well understood by a lot of people that aren't familiar with the Pacific Flyway. Kind of, I guess, at a high level, why is it so important, and what are some of the issues that are facing that system?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Yeah, I like to start pretty broad because I'm not always sure how familiar people are with Great Salt Lake. But yeah, to go from a really 10,000 foot level, Great Salt Lake is a terminal lake ecosystem, which means water flows in but not out, leading to the accumulation of salts over time, which is why Great Salt Lake is hypersaline. Water flows in via 3 kind of major tributaries, and where the water flows into the lake, we have hundreds of thousands of acres of both managed and unmanaged wetlands that, of course, in turn support millions of migratory waterfowl, as well as lots of other species of water birds and shorebirds. Like Amelia mentioned, a lot of our western wetlands are directly linked to seasonal snowpack, and that's how our habitat conditions kind of change over time. And Great Salt Lake has been steadily declining in surface level elevation over the last several decades, due primarily to water diversions, and then that has been really magnified in the last decade by extreme drought conditions. So in November of 2022, actually, Great Salt Lake reached its lowest ever recorded elevation. And because the Great Salt Lake is so incredibly shallow, it's basically like a big dinner plate. A small change in surface level elevation corresponds to a massive difference in the surface area. So at that low recorded elevation, we had about 50% of the lake bed was exposed. And I mean, you can imagine this is a pretty big area with half of the lake bed gone, how much habitat loss that corresponds to, and all of the ecosystem stress on our wetlands. And there were some reports coming out at that time that if that trajectory kind of continued, that Great Salt Lake could go dry within 5 years, which was incredibly alarming and obviously very concerning. And also there's public health concerns associated with the Great Salt Lake drying. We were exceptionally fortunate to have one of the largest ever recorded snowpacks that following winter, so winter 22 to 23. And during the spring runoff, the lake came up about 5.5 feet. We were fortunate again to have another above average snow year in 23 to 24, which brought the lake up to a 7-year high. So to kind of put it in perspective, having one exceptional snow year and another good snow year still wasn't enough to kind of bring the lake up to any kind of historic level. Currently, the lake is sitting at an elevation of 4,193 feet, which probably doesn't mean anything to anyone on here, but for reference, the state of Utah has kind of set a range of target elevations for the lake at which, you know, we kind of have healthy wetlands, a healthy lake ecosystem. It's supporting all of the, you know, industry associated with the lake. And those target elevations start at 4,198. So we're still 5 feet below what would be considered a generally healthy and resilient lake level. And the state as a whole, Utah is still in abnormally dry conditions, but it's not anything as extreme as those extreme drought conditions we were seeing 2 years ago. And despite the Great Salt Lake still being in this kind of period of, I would say, recovery from the extreme drought, managers have indicated that wetlands are generally in good condition. we did have a really dry, hot summer, but we've gotten some pretty substantial late summer rains that have contributed to wetter conditions out in our wetlands. Local duck production has been pretty high both this year and last, and temperatures are starting to decrease. But ultimately, we just need it to snow a lot more again for this year, several more years, to bring the lake up to kind of that healthy target elevation.
So, Karina, from a wetland management sort of waterfowl hunting perspective, as we get into the fall, given the rise in lake levels that you described, do things look different this year than they did, let's say, 2 years ago when the lake was at its lowest recorded level? How does that affect waterfowl hunters from an access standpoint, from a food quality, from a habitat quality standpoint? What can you tell us about that?
Sure. I mean, from an access standpoint, like some of the boat launches just didn't exist when the lake was at its lowest recorded level. I mean, it was just like completely dry and desolate in areas that are generally wet. So obviously, ducks aren't going to respond at that landscape scale. There's just so much less habitat for them to go to. The managed wetlands luckily have very senior water rights in Utah. So generally those areas are still able to produce good forage for migratory waterfowl, even in exceptionally dry years. But, we also need the unmanaged wetlands, and we need water on the landscape, to create a diversity of habitats for the diversity of species that use Great Salt Lake.
Speaking of diversity of species, we now have question number 3 about cinnamon teal. Karina, whenever I was out there in Salt Lake City earlier this year, you and I did some touring of the wetlands and of some of those areas, and we saw quite a few cinnamon teal, absolutely gorgeous birds. I was marveling on them. I had seen them in California, so it wasn't the first time I'd ever seen them, but it had been a while. So just wonderfully beautiful birds. Do you have any idea, indication of productivity of cinnamon teal in that area this year? Is there any research going on? Are there any brood surveys being conducted? What kind of familiarity do you have?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the familiarity is somewhat anecdotal because a lot of the state waterfowl management areas aren't doing brood surveys because Great Salt Lake just doesn't contribute as many ducks to, Pacific flyway populations. However, Great Salt Lake used to be a really significant area for cinnamon teal production prior to the floods of the 1980s. So Great Salt Lake had this extreme flooding event for 3 years in the late 80s that flooded out a lot of nesting habitat for cinnamon teal and redheads and other species that nested there. And when the lake started to recede, a lot of the nesting habitat became invaded by a grass called Phragmites, which I know is a problem in many other areas of North America. But so it's kind of a sad story. But, my sense is that cinnamon teal production has definitely been up locally in the last 2 years, but probably nothing to what it was historically.
Thank you very much. Karina, are you going to be able to stick around for the rest of the event as well?
Sure.
All right. Well, if you have any more questions about the Great Salt Lake or about Klamath, make sure you drop those in the comment section, and we will come back to those here a little bit later on. But now we're going to throw this cinnamon teal question to Dan. How are cinnamon teal doing, Dan? Let me just put it to you right like that.
Well, I'll back up and say it's hard to quantify sometimes because cinnamon teal and blue-wing teal during that kind of breeding season can be difficult to differentiate, and Fish and Wildlife Service, I think, does that geographically. So we tend to think to the east, we consider anything that we see like that as a blue-wing teal, and to the west, we call them cinnamon teal. Some of that range shift has occurred. I think we're starting to see more blue-wing teal in California, which is interesting. I'd be curious to see how other states in the west are looking at that. But from the states that do the waterfowl surveys in spring, which is Washington, Oregon, and California, the cinnamon teal numbers are a little varied. So in California, they're up a pretty big increase over last year, about up by 38%, and so they're above long-term average. In Oregon, they are kind of recovering from last year's low, but they're still far below that long-term average, about 50%. And Washington, kind of the same trend. They're down 65% from last year and remain 75% below long-term average. So kind of as you move further south, you see a better response from cinnamon teal. But as Karina mentioned too, there's other states that cinnamon teal breed in, right? So Colorado, Utah, I'm sure some parts of Nevada and Idaho as well. So be interesting to see how those go.
You want to move on to talk about the larger duck population trajectories and numbers for the Pacific Flyway?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh,
Before we do, in the harvest, they're undifferentiated
that's
too
right.
from blue wing.
yes, they are.
Right.
Yeah.
It's-
Well, and if you get your harvest report, it'll say cinnamon blue wing.
right,
That's not a hybrid.
right.
It's just one of those species.
We don't know.
We don't know. You can't tell from a wing.
You ever shot a hybrid? Or a cinnamon?
No,
Way to
I've
confuse
never shot a cinnamon. I remember the first time I really saw one, kind of off track here, but I was scouting a bunch of ducks, and I was sitting in the truck. Binoculars popped up on the window, watching this bunch of ducks and feeding a rice field, and just really enjoying watching them. And I kind of scanning across there. The hell! And there was a cinnamon, and talking jumped right out at
was,
you.
didn't you?
Yes, sir.
They're a gorgeous bird. Okay, let's see if we can get back to the PowerPoint there, Mr. Chris Isaac. There we are. Okay, so I did something like this similar to this last year, where we pull out the strata that contribute substantially to birds that will make it down through the Pacific Flyway. This is not a full depiction of all the birds that are going to come into the Pacific Flyway, right? But this is a good approximation of the majority. And so when I say the Alaska, Alberta, BC, Washington, Oregon, California, those are the strata that we're pulling from for these estimates. And these kind of account for what are known as western mallards. Alaska was, and I guess I partitioned these out between Alaska and then those other regions. Alaska was up 33% from last year, and then the other combined states, just about the same, down 3% by number from last year. Those two different stocks of birds, if you will, are important because of adaptive harvest management protocols for the Pacific Flyway. And then when you look at total ducks from all of those combined strata, Alaska all the way down through California, recognizing that there are other birds from the prairies that will make their way over. This captures the majority of them. The total Pacific Flyway sources, total ducks for the Pacific Flyway sources were up 20% from last year, about 5% up from the long-term average. Dan, you want to stop here and kind of talk about this? I have two other slides related to California mallards and kind of what's going on with those. You want to talk about these a little bit?
Yeah, let's get back to California, but let's talk about like these bigger numbers and really what they might mean. And I think, when we first started talking about this, those really good conditions in Alaska last spring kind of did potentially, we could be seeing that increase in production that we're seeing this year, particularly from the mallards. You showed that split between kind of the western or the southwest part of that flyway and the north part of that flyway being Alaska. And the overall mallard number not changing too much out here in the west is really carried by Alaska. When we look at total duck numbers, a lot of that is from what we're seeing, what's happening with widgeon and with teal, and those really big population increases. I think it was almost over a million increase in the widgeon population in the region that you're looking at, and teal were up really high too. And that kind of part of the survey captured this year, not typically, but this year, something like 2/3 all the widgeon in the continent. So that was pretty surprising to see. So
we'll get back to that widgeon conversation here a little bit later on. I want to quickly go back to the PowerPoint, the presentation here. Dan, you sent me these two graphs. This one showing California mallards, both breeding population size and harvest, plotted on the same graph, both of them declining since the year 2000. And then we look at just California mallards as a proportion of total harvest. I think what this means is mallards in the California duck harvest as a proportion of total duck harvest, declining on both in all ways of depicting that information. This is obviously sort of a concern when we see these longer term trajectories. We've talked and alluded to the fact that when we see one number from one year, we don't necessarily freak out or draw a conclusion or fundamentally change a conservation approach that we are taking or investing in. But when we see a longer term trend, and not saying that 25 years is the time frame over which we have to see that before acting, but that we're just demonstrating here, when we see this, it tells us there's something real going on and it's of concern to us. What can you tell us?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll just point out here, like, I'm not the first one to identify this problem by any means. It's been a trend for a long time, and we've been concerned about it. It's sometimes challenging to address, and when we look at those numbers, obviously that's a correlation, right? We're not associating a cause or calling something out to be specific. But to see the fact that our average kind of take of mallards has declined pretty dramatically as our breeding population has declined, it tends to suggest, and some of this has been really well supported with band derivation data, just show that if you're in California and you shoot a mallard, it probably grew up in California. So we're not relying on those winter migrant mallards necessarily. So if we want to continue to harvest mallards, we have to grow them. And to do that, we really need that spring habitat. And so one of the folks actually at the California, Dan Scalos, actually put together some great data that looked at landscape trends, how that land is actually being used, whether it's in row crop production, kind of cereal grains, or even tree crops, how those trends have changed over time. And what we really see is those agricultural landscapes in the valley, which typically produce mallards, have been shifting to these agricultural types that mallards are less able to nest in. Things like almond orchards, walnut orchards, things like that. So trying to address that is a big challenge. One thing that is exciting is recently the California hunters have actually moved to improve funds to be available for California Department of Fish and Wildlife folks to address this problem directly, and that's been the origination of this NBHIP, or the Nesting Bird Habitat Initiative Program. And so that was funded through increase in cost for upland bird and duck validation. And so those funds, I think it's about $2 million annually, will go towards addressing these problems on both public and private land. And so that's going to be both grassland conservation, easement opportunities there, trying to find better ways to get agricultural practices to align with when nesting mallards need that landscape and when they can be productive. And that's been combined with a lot of their efforts to promote kind of that summer water so that these broods have somewhere to go, regardless of how much nesting habitat you have. And summer water in California is challenging, particularly when we've been on a high number of drought years.
We're going to pin that conversation for a little bit later on, but that's some great information related to something that I'll be honest, I wasn't aware that the trend and the length of time that trend had been in place was as strong, was as steep as it is. So appreciate you sharing some of that information. I want to move on now. Last year we had several people ask us, what about geese? What's the population status of those birds? What can you tell us about productivity for this year? And so I'm pleased to report that we have a goose expert on the line with us, Frank Baldwin with Canadian Wildlife Service, and he's got some great information. I'm going to toss it to Matt Dyson to lead this discussion. I've got a map here. If y'all need it, let me know, and we'll bring this up if it's necessary. But Matt, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Mike, and we're really fortunate to have Frank with us today. Frank, we had Phil on earlier. He talked a little bit about, the surveys, flying the surveys, what he was seeing out there. And similarly, you spend a lot of time up in the Canadian Arctic with geese. But can you tell us a little bit about how we survey them differently and what types of methods we use to estimate their populations?
Yeah, certainly. And just like thank you guys for having me today. So we use a combination of survey methods. The Canadian Wildlife Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, different state agencies, provincial agencies. It's a great big partnership to get this work done. So we use a combination of, I think you've spoken about it before, Lincoln estimates or Lincoln-Peterson estimates, which use banding data and annual harvest data from harvest estimates. So really important. Hunters have a real major contribution in providing the data for in the form of band recoveries and participating in harvest surveys to generate these estimates. So the reason they're important is the Canadian Arctic and Alaska, they're massive places, huge distributions. A lot of these geese nest at really low densities, and so they're not really practical in many cases to survey using conventional aerial surveys. So there are still places that use aerial surveys, especially in subarctic areas or for things like Canada geese, where it's hard to differentiate different subspecies or different populations in the harvest. So you can think of something like a subarctic Canada goose or a giant Canada goose. You can't differentiate them in the harvest. So they're really not possible to produce Lincoln estimates with those. So in those cases, there's surveys flown throughout the subarctic, and the estimates are produced similar to the way the duck estimates in the traditional area or the eastern survey area are produced.
Great. Thanks, Frank. And I mean, just, huge hat tip to yourself and your colleagues for just the logistics around doing some of this work in a lot of these northern communities or northern areas in terms of the flights in, the time you all spend there to do this important work, to bring us this data that's really important for the management of these species. Do you have any notable results from surveys and for this year? Any populations that you're kind of maybe watching a little bit more closely or concerned with? And I can certainly think of a few, but just curious for your insight, maybe.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so we just returned from banding in a variety of places. Our office, based in Winnipeg here, we run 5 banding sites in the Canadian Arctic, and then our colleagues in Alaska run several others, and then some of the folks in northern region and CWS run some more. So all told, there's about 9 or 10 different banding sites across the north. And the good news is similar to prairie ducks, where water drives productivity, with Arctic geese, timing of spring conditions really drives productivity in Arctic geese. And this year was pretty average to slightly early average timing of spring, and pretty much across the board, pretty good production. So the only real exceptions are parts of Baffin Island, where productivity was poor for snow geese and cackling geese, but were high for Ross's geese. So maybe we'll start in the Pacific Flyway. So reports from crews in Alaska, which ban snow geese, brant, white-fronted geese, and then on Banks Island, which bans snow geese, birds that go to the Pacific Flyway. Good production there, pretty early spring. And then moving into the Mississippi Central Flyway areas in the Central Arctic, on West Hudson Bay, Southampton Island, all really good production of all species. So cackling geese, snow geese, Ross's geese, really good production of white-fronted geese on Victoria Island, where I was. Really nice to see. And then moving over to the Atlantic Flyway, about average good production on Violet Island, which where all the greater snow goose work is conducted. So sort of bucking the trend of the past. The past few years have been decent, but prior to that, pretty low productivity for a lot of different populations of Arctic geese. So we're hoping to see that translate into a really strong fall flight. We do fall productivity surveys when they get down here, so we get a real, a more accurate picture of proportions of young in the total population. Whereas, in banding, we're seeing productive birds. But happy to report, no busts in production for Arctic geese.
Well, I think that's probably certainly some welcome news for some of our goose hunters, and what some young juvenile birds in the fall flight might bring for opportunity this fall. So really appreciate you sharing some of that. What about, I guess, in some of these species where, obviously productivity, this is great news for some of these species that have kind of seen some ongoing declines from their peaks in 2008, thinking here maybe about mid-continent greater white-fronted geese right now. Any conversations around some of those declining populations, or is it just more we need to continue to watch the data and some of these trends in productivity?
Yeah, certainly conversations. There's always conversations at these international meetings. But importantly, there's up-to-date management plans for all these populations. Most of them use a combination of harvest rates, so the proportion of the population that's killed by hunters each year, and also a threshold in the abundance estimate to make decisions. So some of the populations definitely, most of them are in a bit of a short-term decline. Some are steeper than others, but importantly, it's not harvest that's driving that. Those are environmental factors, mostly low productivity, related to spring phenology, possibly some other issues around carrying capacity for some of the really large populations like snow geese. So definitely watching them, but right now, jurisdictions are really following the plans that they agreed to, which call for both a harvest rate that's above a threshold and a population that's below a threshold.
Thanks, Frank. Well, certainly some great information for those interested in geese here, and always a great source of information on geese. Another great resource for folks, I think, if they're interested in learning more about geese and geese ecology and how we manage and monitor those populations. The Arctic Goose Joint Venture website's a really great resource as well that you can go to, and they've got some really cool history and information available there. Mike.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Frank. Quick reminder, encourage people to like and subscribe to the Ducks Unlimited YouTube channel and the video that you're seeing here tonight. Share it with your friends. Kind of build some energy around it. We're trying to bring some good stuff to y'all. Anybody else have questions for Frank? Here, we've got a number of, besides you, we have a number of questions rolling in. Y'all are doing a great job with the questions, but I think Scott has a question.
Yeah, Frank, I know there are a lot of people in Jimbo's part of the world that are interested in what to expect for white-fronted goose production. So I know you said generally it was a pretty good year. When you think about the areas that are primary breeding areas for white fronts, what would you say about prospects in those areas?
Should be pretty good from what I've heard. Things were good in Alaska. Where I was on Victoria Island, really fantastic production. Goslings were really big too. They were almost fledged by the time we were leaving August 10th, so that's quite early. And Central Arctic we're less sure about, so that's an important breeding area for white-fronted geese. Our banding crew didn't get into that area this year because of a helicopter mechanical issue, but definitely what I saw on Victoria Island and then hearing from Alaska looks like it should be a good year.
That's good news.
That'll get you excited.
You bet.
I think we're at the point now where we're for question and answer. Do you have any? I know you do.
I do. I've always got questions.
Okay, you get one. Then we're going to go to some of those that are online because we have some great questions that have been submitted from the viewers.
I knew you was going to tell me that, so I've been studying my list, thinking if I got to pick this one,
pick your best
what is
one.
It? And this one's pretty simple, but yet I think important. We always talk about the importance of May ponds and the inverse relationship between pond numbers and production. What constitutes a pond?
Well, let's back up first. I don't know that we have an inverse relationship between ponds.
Redneck terminology. My bad. The correlation between ponds. My apologies.
More ponds is a good thing.
Of course.
Okay.
I really. But what makes a pond a pond? So I hear buddies that go to Canada fishing in the summertime and say, "Oh, we see a lot of ducks." But what's a pond? It's different than permanent water. What constitutes a pond?
So I'm going to see if Phil wants to take this question, because what you're probably there's a couple of different ways we could look at this. One is what constitutes a pond when they're doing the surveys.
Mm-hmm.
And the other that you may be thinking of is what constitutes a pond that is going to be a highly productive wetland for waterfowl this year. And so there's probably different things.
That was too wide too wide of a net, but I was kind of meaning both, basically.
Okay.
Yes.
So you managed to get two questions in one after all.
Yeah, no, I snuck it in there.
Phil, you want to take that?
Oh boy. Well, May ponds have changed over the years from when they first set up the survey in the 40s and 50s. There was a lot more ponds that were not tilled. And so you're counting a pond that's 6 inches deep and probably 12 by 12 feet or so is about the smallest one that you would count. And there's certain rules about not counting ditches and some other things like that. So some of that is that you get people in the plain that are not waterfowl biologists, haven't been to the prairies before. So you have to have something that's consistent that they know, all right, should I count that or not? And as opposed to analyzing each pond going, let's see, would a mallard nest there? Would a pintail nest there? You have about 1 to 2 seconds over each pond. And so the observer's really counting ponds ahead of the plane and then counting the ducks on those ponds. In a drought or coming out of a drought, when we have a lot of water on the landscape, but the ponds have all been tilled, we're counting a lot of tilled ponds. You see pintails on them and other ducks on them, but so there's a lot of controversy on what are May ponds and are we really counting ponds that ducks aren't going to be using? And probably some of them are ponds that aren't usable by ducks, at least for brood rearing. Early arrivals to the prairies are using a lot of those ephemeral and temporary ponds, even if they're tilled ponds.
Thank you.
Yeah, what I'd offer, Jim, is that, really when we think about this, we'd love to measure the component of the wetland that is really productive from a food standpoint for waterfowl, because that's the resource that they're getting out of there. And like Phil said, some wetlands may be semi-permanent that are a little deeper. Maybe it's kind of a perimeter around the wetland. So ponds is something that we can count when you're flying in the plane, but it's not actually the real resource that we'd like to quantify. Mm-hmm. So, that's why I'd say there's a little bit of variation in the numbers. The pond may be there, but maybe it's shallower and more of the pond is productive in 1 year when we first get wet than after it's been flooded for a while and those kind of things. So, really ponds are an index to food resources, I think, for the female and then the brood when they hatch. So that's the way we think about it, but that's the best metric we've come up with without being able to really spend, 15 minutes quantifying what's there before moving on to the next one.
And I think a lot of people ask that question.
Yeah.
I'll be quiet now for Mike.
The more ponds you have, the more ducks you'll have, because ducks, we've found, like water and ponds.
They are called waterfowl.
So, and this year we had less ponds in Saskatchewan and we had less ducks.
Yep. We appreciate that, Phil. And we may have another question for you before the night's over here. I do want to go east here with a question that came in. And Mike Schumer, Mike, you're still on the call here. So I'm going to direct this one to you and Matt. And the question is, curious what you think is mainly contributing to black duck population increases in the Atlantic provinces. Mike, you want to take that first?
No.
You want to punt it to Matt?
I'm gonna punt it to Matt. He's the Canadian voice here, so let's give him a shot at it, and then I'll do my speculation following. How's that?
That sounds fine to me.
Yeah,
Matt?
I'll caveat anything I'm about to say too around this. There's some speculation happening as well, of not being somebody who's actively studying black ducks per se, but I think in general, Mike alluded to this. Habitat conditions have been relatively stable in these areas, and certainly we saw declines in black duck populations previously. Those populations, though, really over the past 10 to 15 years have been relatively stable, if not increasing in a lot of those years. And so we have adequate habitat on the landscape, and a lot of those habitats too are in some cases, especially in Atlantic Canada, we've got a lot of some pasture land that's probably fairly good for black duck productivity as well, and as well as appropriate habitat for them to come settle in, and in the boreal forest and some of those areas where those ducks are going to be reproducing and likely having a little bit higher productivity as a species that's a little bit more adapted to those habitats as opposed to the mallard or something like that. So I think that's where we see those probably bigger increases in black ducks over the past few years, but I think that there's probably lots to learn still about what's really driving that black duck increase recently. Yeah.
Mike, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I know DU Canada, and there's money that flows from the States up to Eastern Canadian provinces. Can't be hurting, right? Good projects, in that region. As Matt alluded, I think there are still things that we need to learn about black ducks and habitat use and the kind of interaction between mallards and black ducks. We did some, it's not published, but we did some work in the Adirondack Mountains, which is kind of boreal-ish and similar to some of the Eastern Canada region. And to a large degree in that part of the world, mallards had kind of replaced black ducks as the primary bird. And it's not that they have to compete, beat on each other or anything like that, like they're actually fighting over space. But if a mallard settles in a pond, it's used space, right? And so just the presence of those mallards could have a negative impact on black ducks. And we've kind of there was a lot of that work in the 80s and early 90s, and we just aren't talking about it a lot, and we kind of swept it under the rug. So I'm still one that thinks that that's a discussion. And so maybe mallard's not doing as well for, again, multitudes of potential reasons that we don't have time to talk about here. In the East, mallard's not doing as well. Maybe the black duck's taking advantage of that. But at the end of the day, this stuff's really, habitat driven and ensuring that we've still got, quality stuff on the landscape and good places for them to come on the Atlantic coast in the winter too. I mean, it's kind of a megalopolis from like New York. Well, let's go with Boston down to the Chesapeake, that core wintering area of black ducks. And so there's a lot of work to be done to sustain that habitat for those birds as well. And there's been a lot of money pumped into coastal programs as well. So I'm done going on a limb. We'll call it good. That's all speculation. And maybe some kids out there got some research ideas or something. But yeah, I think it's a positive thing for sure, and we'll take it, right?
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to move on to the next question here, and this one might interest you, Jimbo. There's actually two people that have chimed in on this topic. Everyone says the ducks have shifted away from Arkansas, especially Stuttgart. What do you see? My instinct is to blame Jimbo for shooting them all, but I realize that's probably not the case. And so another person wanted to sort of echo this question, and this gets at the perennial question that we've heard here about our distributions of ducks or waterfowl more broadly shifting during fall and winter. And the short answer to that is yes, there are some data that indicate for some species and some geographies there have been substantial shifts over time. If we want to talk about snow geese and white fronts down on the Gulf Coast, if we want to talk about Canada geese from Texas, or cackling geese from parts of the Texas coast, yes, those shifts occur. Ducks are mobile. They respond to an ever-changing environment, and when those things change sort of systematically or directionally, we would expect waterfowl to change as well. And so there's a number of data sets that are supporting that. With regard to ducks in the Mid-South, we have recently completed a study in collaboration with researchers at the University of Missouri, U.S. Geological Survey, as well as U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I will also plug the Ducks Unlimited magazine. There will be an article coming out in the November-December issue covering that particular topic, where we took it a step farther than what some previous scientists had done, and we broke it into. We looked at multiple species of ducks, and we took those, I think, 3 species of ducks: mallards, pintails, and blue wings. And let's just take mallards for example. We split them into different subpopulations and analyzed band returns. The spatial distribution of band returns during different months. And what we found is that, yes, during some months there are, you going to be okay over here? During some months, those shifts of band recoveries have occurred, but they occurred differently. Like for population of mallards out of the Great Lakes in Ontario, their population, band recovery distributions have shifted more to the northeast. If you look at birds, I believe it's out of the Prairie, Canada. We split birds into Prairie, Canada, and also Prairie, U.S., and I forget which was which, but one of them had a distribution in like January that moved slightly north. One of them had a distribution that moved slightly northwest. The epicenter, though, of mallard harvest in the Mississippi and Central Flyway, though, continued to be right around Stuttgart, Arkansas. There were some minor shifts depending on how you parse it. So the take-home point is that, yes, ducks and waterfowl in general do shift their distributions in time in response to a whole host of things that are occurring, whether it be landscape change, climate change, changes in seasonal weather patterns, and habitat availability. But the way that the degree of those shifts, the direction of those shifts varies based on the species or the time, and so there's not a simple description to that.
You hear a lot of people talk about, generally those mallards that shifted west. You hear a lot about Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas, Nebraska, which there's a lot of great duck hunting out there. But as you guys all well know, you look at the band reports, you don't see that shift based on the science. And just the being on the ground, if you're riding through a pasture road way up, you'll come up on an old duck blind on the slough that's some cowboy built 50 years ago. They've been shooting ducks out there a long time, and I think a lot of folks just now kind of starting to realize there's some ducks in the Central Flyway.
And not many people.
Yeah, there's getting to be more and more, and that's
Dan, anything else from the Pacific Flyway in terms of we put out that article. We even did had a podcast episode here recently where we covered the Klamath issue and then sort of a state-by-state spring breeding population, state survey coverage. Any idea? We had some general discussions about habitat conditions, what that might mean for productivity from some of those local areas, California, Oregon, Washington. Do we know anything else kind of since that episode? How would you characterize it? Would it be, again, average? To kind of
not too high, not too low, right in the middle.
Right around the average, yeah.
I mean, I'd like to hope it's average. There's so many different places, it's hard to say generally broad sweeping. We didn't see a general trend across everything. We saw some interesting trends in California. Certain areas stayed really nice and wet and fresh, one of them being even Sassoon Marsh, which is historically a really important place for waterfowl production. I think it has some of the highest recorded nest densities of mallards in North America. So to see that area kind of return to some of that is great. Northeastern, the things that we've been hearing from our federal partners over there has been really exciting, and it goes beyond just ducks. They're banning a lot of waterfowl. They're seeing a lot of broods. It seems like brood survival is pretty high, but then a bunch of waterbird species are also responding, which is fantastic. In some of the other regions, I know that Oregon looked pretty good in some places, but it can be a little dry. They noticed a definite lack of sheet water towards the Willamette Valley. And then Washington was kind of in a harder spot. It seemed to be in a bit of a drought, low snowpack. And we're starting to see an interesting trend there that happened over the last few years where the state, when they do survey it, is split between eastern and western Washington. Traditionally, eastern Washington had a lot more production on mallards, and we're actually seeing in this year, western Washington was almost even. And that's not to say western Washington's spectacular in producing a bunch of mallards. It's more that the east kind of dropped off a bit there. So there's some concerns as far as production there.
I guess one opportunity I wanted to provide is for any of our guest panelists that are online, if they had any additional thing to provide or any questions that they wanted to raise, I think it would be appropriate. Let us know if y'all have something you want to contribute, and we can bring you in. In the meantime, Jimbo, any more questions? We're going to be running out of time here pretty short.
Got more people on there with questions before I can throw one out there?
And I want to know when we're going to talk about widgeon.
Yeah, you keep
talk about it now.
Yeah,
that's right.
That's a good
talk
point.
About that. Okay, so you're going to take that one.
Well, I'll start.
So the context, 55% increase in widgeon this year. What was the widgeon number last year? I just so happened to have that. Down 14 last year, but up 55% this year.
Yeah, which I guess when we think about that, that's a pretty remarkable increase. Probably not. We would probably say didn't really happen out there. So, question of what might be going on. I know we had the conversation last year when the numbers in Alaska were significantly down. And so I guess the point I would make is keep in mind that, all those transects that we showed in the slide at the beginning were really set up in the beginning to count mallard populations based on what the distribution of mallards is. So when we think about widgeon, mostly a boreal breeding species, just it's not going to do as good a job of capturing the ups and downs of those species. So just something that we saw in the survey. It's like probably maybe missed a few last year, saw a big increase this year, picked more up along the transects, but interesting. And the pickup wasn't in Alaska this year. It was in Yukon and areas further east. So good news for widgeon, but I think we probably don't have great resolution on some of those populations.
Phil, do you have any insight on that? Like when you see a 55% increase in that number, I mean, this is a sample. We talked about that. It's not a census. We know there's measures of variation. Scott's description of that, does that kind of ring true with the way you think about some of the numbers that we might see from year to year?
Yes. another example of a bird that you can look at on the survey are pintails, where when the prairies of Saskatchewan or when the grasslands of Saskatchewan and Alberta are dry, pintails favor that area. When they're dry, they go north into the boreal forest, and our transects up there are much wider, much farther apart than 12 miles, which is in Saskatchewan. So you have a lot, it's about 2,000 miles from southern Saskatchewan to the northern boreal forest in Alaska. So it doesn't look that big on a map, but when you think about that, it's huge. They migrate from Texas. It's only about 700 miles. So, but all that territory, who knows, maybe the areas of the transects that they counted them on were really wet. I know most of the territories were dry, and it wasn't until north of Great Bear Lake up at the Arctic Circle where it became wet and had excellent habitat. So there's also a huge area to the east of our transects in Nunavut over to the Hudson Bay that isn't surveyed at all. We've done some experimental surveys in that area, and there's a lot of ducks in that area. But again, it's, as you've said a couple times, it's an index, and sometimes the ducks get lost, and sometimes they probably get found too much, maybe.
All right, we have a couple of other questions that have come in, and it's getting late in the evening, and they are one of them is definitely humorous, and so it deserves asking. The other one has some humorous elements to it, I think, but it's a good one. I'm going to ask it too.
This is the comedy portion of the show.
This is the comedy portion of the show. Should we say the name of the people that I haven't been doing that? The people that have been writing these questions. Should we kind of give a shout out? All right, we'll do that on these. Okay. Sorry to the rest of you. Kevin Ringelman had about 3 or 4 different questions that he submitted. So Kevin, you get a shout out. Apologies for the rest of you whose names I'm not going to recall. Blake Harrell directs this question to Scott. Did Scott bring his song dog decoy to show everyone? That's the coyote decoy.
Yeah, I did not bring it along, but I just moved decoys into a new shed, so I saw it over the weekend. So it is still present
just
out
one.
there. Just didn't come with me to Memphis, so that one's pretty easy.
If you're wondering what we're talking about, you need to tune into the Ducks Unlimited podcast to learn more. So I'll leave it at that.
Shameless plug.
That's right. And so then the other one, this one is from John Brasher, if I'm looking at that right. And I actually don't know the answer to the last part of this. Is there any correlation between coot numbers and other duck numbers? Are coot numbers tracked year to year? Now, I know Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries includes coots in their winter surveys. I don't know if coots and other types of water birds are included or counted on the surveys, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service surveys. Phil, what can you tell us?
Yes, we do count coots.
Where are those numbers?
They must be in the webless report. That's a good question, because I just started thinking, where are those numbers? Because we count them. Interesting thing about coots is too, I've seen over the years in the air and on the ground that they have an innate sense of where permanent water is going to be. And if you don't see coots in the grasslands, you know that water is probably not going to be there very long.
I have another coot question.
Go for it.
Have any of y'all ever seen a large flock of coots migrating?
Like
I
flying?
think they show up on a bus, or like flying, or they got an underground railroad.
I've seen a coot decoying into the timber.
Oh, of course, yeah.
I've heard a lot of anecdotes that they might migrate through the mud.
Yeah.
No, I've never seen a flock.
I've never, other than, if you're running a boat across some deep water, you may run through a flock and they get up and move, but I've never seen a high bunch of coots come to a rest area.
No.
I'm willing to stand to be corrected, but I think in truth, I believe they're nocturnal migrants.
I think that's
you're probably right.
Yeah.
So we have a number of other questions here. We're not going to be able to get to all of these. Roger was the new DU Canada feed? What is the latest on the bird flu situation? I'll just say, Roger, stay tuned to that. We're going to try to connect with someone who's actually an expert in that field. We do that about this time every year. That's going to be forthcoming on the Ducks Unlimited podcast. We haven't done that one yet, but we're going to try to. Had two people asking this question here. From Jeremy Fink, I was curious as to the thoughts on how we think the central flyway numbers may be different from last year with the rise of population numbers through the Pacific Flyway. I think what we may be talking about here is if we look at maybe as birds settle in different parts of the flyway at sort of the more northern reaches, do we know anything about how that would influence their tendency to migrate south through either of those flyways? I don't have a good feel.
I mean, we have our administrative flyways for regulatory purposes, and we describe things, but they move around. We know that, and there's band data to show that. The transmitter data is really doing a good job of showing that. So yeah, I think as we gather more of that and as we learn more of that, I think it'll be interesting. One thing that stood out to me was actually at the recent waterfowl conference was pintail were switching where they're actually nesting. So they'd nest in Alaska one year, and then the next year they'd go to the prairies, and then the next year they go back to Alaska. So it's variable, I would say.
Yeah, I'd like to think of it like that little Plinko game, where you start with it at the top doesn't necessarily mean where it ends
You're
up.
going to wind up.
Yeah, could shift further west on the breeding areas, but depending on local habitat conditions, the ducks have wings. They will find where there's good habitat.
And they are really, really good at sampling habitat.
Absolutely.
I've got several mallard bands, though, to Mike's point, from his part of the world, from the Finger Lakes region in New York, that were killed on the prairie in Prairie County, Arkansas.
Yeah.
We're about out of time, y'all. Any final can't live without question?
It'll run too long.
That's kind of what I figured. Let me make sure I do the appropriate thank yous and everything as we close out. Again, very special thanks to our proud partners, Mossio, the official camo of Ducks Unlimited, and Drake Waterfowl, the official hunting apparel of Ducks Unlimited.
Thank you,
Jimbo,
Mike.
Appreciate you being
bet.
here. Appreciate our friends down at West Point, Mississippi, always being good sponsors, good supporters of Ducks Unlimited. Let's see, who else? I want to make sure that we thank everyone here in the room and that has worked behind the scenes to pull this off. This is year 3 of doing this. We've made a few changes each year along the way. We have definitely a much fancier studio in which to do this year. So thanks to all the departments here at Ducks Unlimited that helped make that possible. In sort of the brain trust here that we can see and that we worked with over the past several weeks with DU Inc., Mallory Murphy, Chris Isaac, Clay Baird, Bobby Meeks, Tyler Katzma, Pepper Self, Nathan Ratchford, Kevin Woods, Katie Tucker. My apologies if I have missed anyone. Did I miss anyone? We think we got them all. On DU Canada side, Justin Fronsack, Jessica Goodsell, Matt, anyone that I'm leaving off? That's we got it there. Definitely thank our panelists. We appreciate you sharing 2.5 hours of your night with us. We wish we could have had everyone here in person, but we very much thank you for everything that you brought to this. And yeah, I mean, it felt like you only spoke for 5-7 minutes sometimes, but we try to cover a ton of information and still got questions that we couldn't get to. Thanks to our viewers, our members, our volunteers. Special shout out to all the Ducks Unlimited volunteers that make us who we are. It's a really exciting time of the year. It's when banquet season is getting fired up. If you have not been to a Ducks Unlimited banquet in a while, I certainly encourage you to do so. Go to ducks.org/events. If you have been to a Ducks Unlimited event, go to another one. ducks.org/events. I will be making my way to a few this fall. It's also one of the things that marked the beginning of this very important season for all of us. I think that's it. Any final words from y'all?
Or if you're Canadian, ducks.ca/events.
There you go.
There you go.
Ducks.ca/events. We got everything in here, fellas. I will leave you with the immortal words of Dr. Scott Stevens. Life is short. You better hunt. We had the first increase in total duck population numbers since 2015. That gives us something to be excited about. We have reports of fair to excellent production all across the far reaches of the north, kind of depending on where you are. So there's something to be optimistic about. Hopefully, you'll get a sense of some crispness and coolness in the air. I can tell you it's not here in Memphis right now. It's 99, then 100, and then 100 the next 2 days. But we're going to get there eventually. And thank you all, and we hope to see you this time next year.
Do you enjoy the Ducks Unlimited Waterfowl Season Outlook? Every year, DU brings you exclusive insights for the hunting season. And in 2024, we're kicking it off with something special. A limited edition WSO 2024 sticker, available only through the end of August. Don't miss out. Visit give.ducks.org/WSO drop now and secure yours while supplies last. Plus, subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss a beat. Your donations and subs make this content possible. Let's keep the tradition alive, together.